What is up, my ducks and drakes? Welcome to the Crawdad Lake. Today we are reading Losing Control, chapters 17 through end, by ElliottGreen333 on Wattpad. If you'd like to follow along with the book, or follow ElliottGreen333 on Wattpad, please go to the description to find the Wattpad. On with the story. Part 17, Virgil. I heard footsteps in the distance. I didn't dare move as I knew it wouldn't end well for me. The owner of the footsteps kept mumbling to themselves. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I could tell by their voice. It was a man. The footsteps moved quickly again, and I heard them fade away. I opened my eyes and looked around. To my relief, he was gone. Tied to a chair, chained to the walls, I was just on the ground, not by Deceit's usual style. I went through the motions to push myself back onto my feet, but my head was pounding. I got to my knees and waited for the pounding to stop before I moved fully to my feet. From there, I looked around. Everywhere was black. From the walls to the floors, I could see light, but from no clear source. The room looked endless, like you would walk forever and never get out. A pit formed in my stomach once I recognized my surroundings. I was on the dark side of the Mind Palace. My old home. My old prison. It was quiet, which wasn't a good thing for the side of the Mind Palace. If it was quiet, it could only mean that the dark sides were fighting with the light sides. I had to go out and help my friends. I took 2 steps before my head pounded again. I was in no shape to fight. But what choice did I have? I noticed a table in front of me with a small lamp sitting on said table. I slowly limped over to it as the memories from this place started creeping back into me. All the old bruises throbbed, all the old cuts threatened to bleed, and my old insecurities started to haunt me again. On the table sat 2 pieces of paper, a map of the Lightside's house, and a voice recorder. I turned the lamp on to get a better look. Both of the papers read different things, but they were all about the same topic. All about me. I picked up the first one, which read, "Anxiety has powers stronger than both me and Remus. If push comes to shove, I'm afraid I cannot let anxiety win. His powers from the light sides are only starting to take effect. I must get my hands on them. We must come up with a plan at once." I put the note down and moved on to the next. "It's happening, Remus." I sighed with shaky hands as I let the papers down. I looked to the map of the house. All of the rooms were labeled, including our rooms. Logan's room, however, had a circle in the corner of his room, where his bookshelf would be. Odd. I looked past it for now, and focused on the voice recorder. I pushed the button labeled play, and held the speaker to my ear.
"Get a load of this, D!"
Remus' voice screamed through the voice recorder. I moved away from it slightly and continued to listen.
"While watching morality in his room, I was able to sneak into Logic's room and read Virgil's book. You were right. It's a goldmine of information. Everything you need to know about how to control his powers and his mind when he's weak enough." "Oh, Deceit, you tickle me like ants crawling on my entire body. I never really thought this plan would work, but you were right. He isn't the same side we raised all those years ago."
The tape cut. My hands were shaking fast and my breathing was hitched. Logan said he'd get rid of those books. He told me to my face. He told that to Patton and Roman. He lied. I dropped the recorder and ran past the table. I had to get out of here. If Deceit has its way with me, who knows what will happen. I kept running towards what I was hoping was an exit. I hadn't been over here in years. I had no reason to come back. I stopped for a minute to catch my breath. I put my hands on my knees and breathed deeply. My mind was racing through everything I had just learned and all the thoughts I was having all at once. They were planning to control the Mind Palace, no doubt about that. But as of now, they were still in step 1 of their plan as long as I could still fight back. I decided to go back to the table to get the voice recorder to show the others. Maybe Logan could figure out their next step, or Roman could understand Remus's comments towards deceit. I turned around to start towards the table when I ran, face first, into a wall. Or at least, I thought it was a wall. I looked upward to meet the eyes of a mustached man with a smile bigger than his face could stretch.
Hello, Virgil.
His voice was wacky like a cartoon. He looked me dead in the eyes as his face grew closer to mine.
Welcome home.
Part 18. Roman. I lifted my head and began breathing heavily as I looked around the room. My room. Wait. My room? When did I get here? My body was still cold and frail with anxious thoughts of Virgil. He was right. What would he think of me if I couldn't save him? I would be a failure. Not only to myself, but to my friends. And Virgil. The one side I felt the deepest connection with. I met Virgil before Logan or Patton did. I actually met Virgil through Remus. He first introduced me to him when Virgil first formed in the Dark Mind Palace. Back then, Remus and I used to sneak away from our respective areas and meet in the imagination to hang out or catch up. The day I met Virgil was no different. I walked to our normal meeting area, where we had created a small hill with a bench and a dragon witch cave nearby in case we got bored. From the distance, I could see Remus walking closer with someone at his side. I ran up to greet Remus and the new person.
Brother, a new side formed in our side of the My Palace today. I thought you should meet him,
Remus said. I still remember meeting him, his bangs in front of his left eye, his old clothing, his dark brown eyes, his pale skin. He hasn't changed much. I remember extending my hand to Virgil, watching him look at my hand like it was a weapon. Hi, I said. My name is Creativity, but you may call me Roman. Virgil's eyes looked into mine, and then back down at the floor. He was very nervous. With my hand still extended, I continued the one-sided conversation. What's your name? Anxiety. He muffled into his jacket sleeve, just loud enough for me to hear. I put my hand down, seeing as I was never going to get a handshake in return.
He's still confused as to what is going on,
Remus explained. And with that, Remus turned on his heel and guided Virgil deeper into the darkness. That was the Dark Mind Palace. I watched until they were no longer visible. Once they were gone, I returned to the Mind Palace. Back then, Thomas was 15. Nearly 2 years later, I saw Anxiety for a second time. I was walking down the hallway towards my room when I saw the back door open. The back door was our connection to the imagination, and since the imagination was the only thing between the Dark Mind Palace and the Light Side Palace, something could be breaking in. I watched as he emerged through the door, quietly shutting it behind him. When he turned around and saw me, he jumped and started shaking. I'm sorry, I got turned around in the imagination. I thought that this was... Relax, it's okay, I said, cutting him off. He looked at me as if I was crazy, eyeing me up and down, looking for any sign that I was lying. His shaking had calmed down, and I smiled at him. His brown eyes were so pretty, and his lips looked soft. While you're here, would you like a tour of the Mind Palace? He shrugged, and I took his hand and pulled him around, showing him every corner. I didn't want him to leave. We were having so much fun, cracking jokes and laughing. He looked like this was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Our final look at the tour was the main room, where we could see, hear, and watch Thomas's life as it unfolds. The console below the screens where we controlled Thomas's was glowing, but Anxiety wasn't watching the console. Who's that? Anxiety asked quietly, pointing to one of the screens where we could see Thomas's... what Thomas sees? Oh, that's one of Thomas's friends, I replied. Thomas? Yeah, the person we live for. Did Remus and Deceit never explain why you were created? He shook his head. I sighed. I heard footsteps come from downstairs. Anxiety and I both looked to see who it was. Both Logan and Patton stopped when they saw Anxiety, who was trying to hide behind me. Roman, who is that? Logan said. His tone sounded angry. Logan, Patton, this is Anxiety, I explained. When did he form? Patton asked as he came closer, which caused Anxiety to step back. He formed around 2 years ago. Remus introduced me to him. I think if you guys got to know him, So he's one of them? Logan questioned, walking over to him. Anxiety froze and let Logan get a good long look at him. Logan was quiet for a second before he turned back to me. He must go back to his side of the mind at once. He does not belong here and could damage Thomas's mind. Logan spat the words at Anxiety, who looked about ready to cry. I huffled and stood between Logan and Anxiety. He can go back when he is ready. He hasn't done anything to anyone. He's harmless. No, he's not, Roman. He is a dark side. All of the dark sides are the same. Destroy and corrupt Thomas. He slipped past you, and, in my opinion, he's way too close to the console. Logan yelled. He pushed me aside into the wall and slowly walked closer and closer to Anxiety, who was backing up and hitting the console with his back. You listen here, you heathen. Do not come back here. Do not tell your friends you were here, and do not ever speak to my friends again. Anxiety nodded, with tears streaming down his face, and his breathing was rapid. Stop! I yelled. You're scaring him! Logan didn't seem to hear me or care for my concerns.
See you later, Thomas,
said a voice at the screen. We all turned our attention towards the screens. We watched through Thomas's eyes. Thomas had come to a crosswalk, and he started walking across it. There was a horn that was blaring from the oncoming car. When Thomas turned his head, we all saw it was no car. It was a bus. Thomas froze as he watched death slowly ram towards him. Anxiety quickly examined the console and started pushing buttons, watching the screen to make sure that he was doing what he thought he was doing. What the hell are you doing, freak? Logan hollered as Anxiety kept working. Patton came over to Logan and pulled him away from Anxiety. Anxiety stopped and pushed one final button, and we watched as Thomas ran across the crosswalk, just missing getting hit by the bus. I smiled in disbelief as Anxiety panted. I ran and scooped him up in a hug. That was amazing, I said. Patton clapped and Logan looked taken back. I put him down and Logan walked over to Anxiety, straightening his tie and clearing his throat. I'm afraid I owe you an apology. You saved Thomas. It is clear that I was wrong about you. Anxiety smiled and then looked over to me. I should probably get back to my side. I nodded and gave him one last hug. Stop by any time, Penn said as we watched him go back upstairs. I sighed. I couldn't get my mind off the dark, strange side now. A couple of weeks after the accident, Remus and I met in the imagination, and he was furious. I was slowly nervous now.
You let him hang around you, light sides? Even let him save Thomas?
Of course, it was amazing, I argued.
Roman, we both know that your side of the Mind Palace is not his domain. He belongs to us.
How can you be so sure? I yelled back. I think he belongs with us. He means well. Remus shook his head.
You're a fool, brother. He will never be like you.
And with that, Remus walked away, and we never met in the imagination again. Maybe 4 years later, Anxiety officially joined the light sides, and the rest was history. I sighed as I came out of memory lane, looking around my room with hot tears coming down my face. This was doing Virgil no good. I had to help him. Deceit is wrong. I love Virgil. I don't care if he doesn't feel the same. He's one of us. I stood up from the floor and went over to my door. I jingled the handle until I realized it was locked from the outside. Part 19. Virgil. My whole body shivered as I met eyes with Remus. He laughed a chaotic and devilish laugh, which made me flinch. He brought his hands together and continued to smile at me. Seeing him like this almost makes me forget that he is even the brother of Roman. How could two twin siblings be so different?
How was the nap, Virgil? I presume you're doing well.
He laughed again. My legs were starting to give out. I was shaking so much. When I still lived with Deceit and Remus, Deceit would hurt me mentally and emotionally, while Remus would do it physically. I didn't want to relive that nightmare. Remus pushed me backward and I fell onto the ground, not willing to fight back. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice drenched in fear. Remus crouched down, so our eyes could meet again. Your aura, of course. Have you even been paying attention? Remus stood up and picked me by my nose. Blood ran down my face and things were beginning to spin. He then grabbed me by the hood and started to drag me back over to where the table about their plan was.
Honestly, Virgil, Deceit wanted your aura more than anything. Something about getting back what was once ours, or something like that. I merely agreed to him to help as long as I got to beat you. The good old days.
Having him dragging me by the hood, starting choking me slightly, I still refused to fight back. Maybe it was old instincts kicking in, but I wasn't going to move a muscle. Threw me against the leg of the table, which caused the lamp to fall onto my head. I rubbed my head and focused on staying alert and present. Never know when I'm gonna need to run.
If I remember the conversation Deceit and I had before I come and knocked you out, Deceit was only going to let you off with a warning for telling your friends. However,
Remus said before kicking me in the stomach. I hunched over, hugging myself. I felt a harsh tug on the top of my head, meeting eyes with Remus, seeing as he was lifting my head by my hair.
Based on how much you've seen our little plan, you'll be staying here for a long time.
He threw my head back down, and my heart nearly beat on my chest when I looked back up at his face. He was frowning. That's never, ever a good sign if he's not happy. That only means punches, kicks, and swings harder. And a big intake of light surrounded the room until the door was shut once again. In came Deceit. I watched as Remus greeted him. Deceit then stomped his way over to me, giving me a smile before turning to Remus. What did he see?
Almost all of it. Just say the word, Deceit, and I'll beat the living shit out of him.
Remus laughed. Deceit put his hand up to quiet the crazed side. He grabbed me by the hand and lifted it, then let it fall. When he saw my hand fall limp, Deceit smiled. There'll be no need to beat him to much further, Remus. He's already on the brink of death. Deceit lowered himself. I think it's time to go into the next phase of our plan. Deceit hissed. My breathing started to pick up. My palms became sweating. Deceit rose up and walked back to Remus.
What about my brother and his friends?
Remus questioned. Oh, they'll be out for a while. I yelled. I put my hand over my mouth. I wish I had done that. Remus took heavy steps over to me and slammed me across my face. My face tingled as I fell on my side, hitting my head on the floor. I didn't even bother to move. I just laid there, a heap of partly dried blood and tears. Pathetic, Deceit whispered loud enough for me to hear. Remus, prepare the chains. Remus bounced away, leaving just me and Deceit. Me and the person who held my powers in their hands. You read our plans, right, Virgil? I did nod back, which didn't make Deceit happy. He moved his hand slightly, throwing me into the wall. I landed weakly on my feet and almost fell forward until Deceit caught me and pushed me back onto the wall. Do you know what happens next? I was still breathing at a rapid pace, but nodded no slowly. Deceit grinned. Then this should be fun. With his hands, he pushed my shoulders deeper into the wall. I tried to fight against his grip, but he was way too strong. He opened his mouth, and I could see his fangs shine. I squirmed more. He was gonna bite me. I could tell by the look in his eye. His mouth grew closer and closer to my neck. All I could do was move around, but then I could barely move at all. Help! I cried out but by that time there was no point. It was too late. His fingers dug deep into my neck and I froze. I couldn't move. I was stuck. I felt a terrible pain in my neck and a thick liquid started pacing through my veins. My eyelids started to droop and I felt Deceit's fangs leave my person. My head dropped, and now that Deceit wasn't supporting it, he lifted my chin so we were face to face. My vision was blurring and my hearing was quieting. While you sleep, you may still be Virgil. But when you wake, you'll be someone old. Deceit whispered. That was the last thing I heard before Deceit dropped me. My eyes closed. Funny. Roman. I started banging on the door with my palm of my hand frantically. I stopped for a second and waited, but heard nothing response. I took a step back from my door, beginning to pace around my room. I had to think of something. I had to get out of my room. More than likely, Pat and Logan are still in their anxiety-filled states. Poor Virgil. After being in the state for at least an hour, I can't imagine being like that all the time. I kept pacing around, my thoughts buzzing like bees going 1,000,000 miles per hour. That all stopped when I heard a scream. Help! It cried. It sounded like Virgil. Virgil! I yelled back. No sound followed. I began to feel tears threaten to spill. In a blind burst of either rage or fear, I walked back over to my door and started to kick my own door down. It was like making a lot of noise. But if Deceit comes back, I really don't care. He may have bested my last time, but this time would be different. I delivered one final blow to the door and watched it all fall down. I stepped out to my room triumphantly and called out once again. Virgil? Roman? I heard a degraded Patton yell from his room. Patton! I yelled back as I ran to his door. I tried to move the doorknob, but to no avail. I knocked on his door and quietly and sporadically time knocked. Patton, I'm right here. Roman, quick. Get me out of here. We've got to help Logan. He shouted back in a panic-filled voice. I nodded to myself and looked for any other way I could enter without breaking down his door. I followed the trim of the door with my eyes. I only stopped when I saw letters on the side of the door frame. I placed my finger over them, feeling the bumpiness of them. I tilted my head and read the message silently to myself. Roman? You still there? Patton questioned. Yeah, sorry, I just found something. What is it? To open the door, you must find the key that is hidden within the trust you keep. I read directly from the door frame. There was a gap of silence between me and Patton, trying to make sense of the riddle meant. Any ideas? I asked hopefully. Well, the truth we keep? We need to share a secret, Patton guessed. Oh, okay. We might as well give that a try. I took a step back, just in case the door swung open in my face. I created the dragon witches in the mindscape. I only blamed it on Remus because it came out a lot scarier than I wanted them to be, I confessed, biting my lip. I waited for the door to swing open and for Patton to come running out in panic, but nothing ever happened. It's not working! Why not? Patton said. I could tell he had begun to cry again. Patton, I think you have to tell a secret, I suggested. I don't have any secrets. I tell you guys everything. I thought for a second. Okay, tell me what Deceit put into your head. No, Roman, I can't. Patton screeched in between tears. You won't trust me again. Yes, I will, Patton. I love you, just like Virgil and Logan do. We're family. Brothers, even. We stick together and never turn our backs against each other. Please, Patton, I begged. I heard a muffled sniff before he took a breath. For the longest time, I felt my true feelings inside, replacing them with happy smiles or dad jokes. It was emotionally draining, but I had to be the ray of sunshine. The seed only knew that would be a mess with me because I used to talk to him about it. I held back a gasp. No, it would hurt him. He used to visit my room. I never knew why until he took my place that one day. He wanted to know how to weaken me so he could take my place. There were a couple more sobs leaking through the closed door before the door swung open. I could see a curled up Patton sitting inside. I ran in and hugged Patton, letting him cry into me. He returned the hug quietly, and soon his crying stopped. We pulled away as he cleaned the dry tears from his glasses. I put my hand on his shoulder and watched his sparkling wet eyes look at me. I hope you know now. You could talk to us. Anytime. Don't let the seat fool you. I know that more than ever now, kiddo. He giggled. Thank you, Rowan. We hugged one last time before I helped Patton up, and we quickly ran to Logan's room. Pim pressed his ear against the door, listening to any type of sound. Logan? Please, can you hear me? Patton yelled, doubting my success. I went to try the doorknob, but then the door opened before I could even touch the doorknob. Patton pushed the door open wider, and we both gasped. Logan was curled in on himself, surrounded by a dark cloud that seemed to be whispering to him. I could barely hear the whispers, but from the little things I could hear, they were saying awful things. Patton slid over to Logan, putting a hand on his back. I reached out to Patton, knowing that it wasn't a good idea. The dark cloud blew a strong gust of wind, and Patton sent him flying into Logan's bookshelf. Patton! I cried as I watched Patton's back hit the shelf. The shelves crashed onto the floor, with Patton landing on top of it all. I ran over to Patton and helped him sit up. He groaned a little bit, but otherwise he seemed okay. We looked at Logan, who was shaking even more. The loud crash must have scared him. His eyes were locked onto the floor, giving no sign of looking away. We moved closer to Logan again, not as close as before, but close. I waved my hand in front of his eyes, but that did nothing. Virgil has had panic attacks almost similar to this before, I said. Pan looked over to me in hope. So what do we do now? No. Actually, I sighed. When they're this bad, I have to wait for Virgil to pass out. Pan's smile faded, and he suddenly looked lost. I hated the fact that I couldn't help Patton. I know how much he likes Logan, but if nothing worked for Virgil, more likely, nothing would work for Logan. He looked back at Logan and made his next move. Logan, I don't know if you could hear me, but if you can, please know that I really enjoy your company. Whether we're filming or just hanging out in the Mind Palace, you've never failed to put a smile on my face, Logan. You're so smart and incredibly patient with me. I could never thank you enough for that. You're kind, generous, and everything anyone could ever want in a friend. And a partner, Logan. I love you. Almost amazement as Patton locked lips with Logan. The dark clouds around his head faded and his eyes closed. Patton pulled back slowly, and Logan's head fell into Patton's lap. Later, Logan lifted his head slowly and looked around. He looked at me, then Patton, then back to me. What happened? How did I get back in my room? I smiled brightly, and Patton wrapped his arms around Logan. He looked stunned before returning it with his warm smile. When they pulled apart, Patton went into him for another kiss. They locked lips, and my heart blossomed. As Thomas says romance, it always warms my heart when a couple, obviously meant to be, gets together. They pulled apart and Logan looked around again. Where's Virgil? I looked down. We have no idea. Logan looked down, starting to think out loud. If Virgil made a deal with the seats, he has to be in the Dark Mind Palace. You don't think they're going to try to make him a dark side again, do you? Patton questioned nervously. I don't know, Patton, Logan cooed. I sighed and looked back at Logan's door. I stared at it for a couple seconds before looking back. If I learned anything from being trapped in my room, I learned we are doing no good by sitting here and simply remembering Virgil. If we treat him as if he's dead, sooner or later he will be. Logan and Patton looked at each other, then back at me. Whatever it takes to get Virgil back, Patton said. I smiled brightly while helping Logan and Patton off the ground. Logan's eyes wandered over to his lump of bookshelf on the floor. Wait, what happened to my bookshelf? Logan said. Patton and I smiled and snickered to each other, while Logan shrugged his bookshelf off his mind, and we left for the back door to the imagination. We're coming, Virgil. Part 21. Deceit. I yelled as I felt the anxious energy I'd previously shot into Patton, Roman, and Logan come back to me. The sudden rush of power only sent a small chill down my spine. It was nothing compared to taking the aura away from Virgil himself. Speaking of, I looked over my shoulder from the table with our plants and saw Remus looking at me attentively. I narrowed my eyes and wiped my body around to fully face him. What are you looking at? I growled. Remus stood in his ground, crossing his arms. That was the one thing about Remus. I couldn't intimidate him. He knew all my tricks and tactics. Remus huffed before talking again.
It's not every day you yell, damn it. You could have been trying to rip apart a living fly without me. I could have missed something.
He pouted. I waved my hand in pure annoyance. Get back to work, Remus, I said. He made a face at me before turning back to the unconscious stack of shit on the floor next to him. He was attacking the cuffs and chains to his wrists, while the ends of the chains were already nailed to the wall. It made the corners of my lips curve into a small smile. It's been years since anxiety was back in our power. It felt good to have him back. I turned back to the table and started thinking about what to do with the light sides now that they were free. While I didn't expect the light sides to break my anxious curse so soon, I knew that sooner or later they would try to come for anxiety. Like it or not, it would happen. But I was prepared. I don't know how long it'll take the venom inside anxiety to truly affect until Virgil is gone, but it shouldn't take too long. I decided to review step 3 in our plan. Reading over it only made anxiety's power inside me bubble even more with vigor than before. Remus, are you prepared to fight when the time calls for it? I hissed. I looked back over at Remus and watched him finish up with anxiety before walking over to me.
Of course, Dee. I'm ready for anything. You'll understand not to meddle with us once I'm through with them. Just thinking about their blood being drained all over the walls makes me giddy.
Remus laughed. I couldn't help but laugh along with him. Nothing was going to mess this up for us. Nothing! I curled my hand into a fist and began phase 3, weakening Thomas. I could see Remus from the corner of my eye, watching as my fist began to glow purple. Anxiety moaned in the corner. I could tell he was feeling the effects of what I was going to do to Thomas. Shut him up, I mumbled. I heard Remus's metal boots pound coldly against the floor, followed by the sounds of him gagging anxiety with a cloth around his mouth.
That should do it,
Remus finished by wiping his hands on his outfit. The glow of my hand faded away as Thomas was fully feeling the effects of the panic attack. As we speak, I smiled, my fangs showing. I even let out a little laugh, which made Remus turn his head. Come along, Remus. That should slow down the light side's travels here.
just love it when you put on a show in the imagination. Remus laughed. We left wickedly until we tucked away in our rooms, where we both noticed a familiar door forming at the end of the hall. Part 22. Logan. I took a step back from the mangled bookshelf that is now on my floor. While it was sad to see it this way, there were more important matters to be dealt with. Pet and Roman were already leaving my room, laughing to themselves about the outbreak over my bookshelf. The memories from before being struck with anxious energy by deceit were starting to come back to me. Well, it wasn't much. I just remembered trying to reach out for Pet and for help. I felt so cold and awful, like every thought I've ever had was fighting against me. I shook the memories from my head for now and walked out of my door. I noticed Roman's door was on the floor. He must have kicked it down. Desperate times call for desperate measures. I looked to my left, where Pet and Virgil's rooms are, but something wasn't right. Where Virgil's door should have been was gone. I walked up to the wall, roughly where the door should be, traced the wall with my fingers, feeling for any clue or hint that the door is there. I felt nothing. I heard a gasp looking over. Roman was covering his mouth, looking at the exact thing I was trying to find. "I'm sorry, Roman," I said softly. "We may be too late." Roman came closer and examined the wall. I was watching his eyes. They were wet with tears that didn't want to come out. I could tell that he was trying to make sense of everything in his mind. "We can't go back now. If Virgil's door is gone, who knows what condition he's in," Pen shouted. Roman and I nodded in agreement as we took slow steps against the wind. Lightning started striking only a few feet away from us. It rattled my core whenever one touched the ground. Roman started to run towards the door, and Pen fell behind. I looked behind us and saw a tornado whirling towards us. Thomas's panic attack must be huge. I began to run as well, catching up with the others quickly. The door was in our sights. We were almost there. Roman was the first to reach it. He opened it wide so we could run in. I grabbed hold of Patton's hand. We both ran through, Roman coming behind us as we slammed the door shut. Patton laid on the ground, trying to catch his breath, while Roman and I put our hands on our knees and calmed down. "That was awful," Patton said. "It's the worst one I've ever seen," Roman remarked. I looked to my right and almost lost my breath again. The others must have seen what I was looking at, as they both gasped as well. With heavy hearts, we walked over to our friend, who was chained to a wall. Part 23. Roman. "Virgil?" Penn choked as he sat on his knees next to Virgil. Seeing him chained to the wall, watching his chest barely rise and fall, was hard to watch. His mouth was hidden behind a handkerchief that was acting as a gag. Logan sat across from Patton and was feeling Virgil's vitals, looking to a minute before finally speaking his mind. "He's alive, but barely," Logan stated. "We need to get him out of here now," Logan ordered. I wasn't going to hesitate any longer. I crouched next to Roman and examined the cuffs on his wrists. They were old and rusty, definitely used before. The idea of them being used previously hurt to think about, knowing that they were probably used on Virgil before. I know how much Virgil hated living with deceit and Remus. Hand on Virgil's wrist and the other on the chains. I pulled until a snap was heard. I ran over to his wrist and did the thing. Patted and tied the gag and threw it to the side. After the second snap was heard, I picked Virgil up bridal style. Virgil moaned as his head rolled into my chest. I smiled, even though this wasn't the time or the place. He was so light in my arms, and he seemed so peaceful. I don't know what Deceit did, but once I find out, he'll be a dead snake man. Logan and Patton led the way out as I fell behind. We walked fast but quiet. I was so happy. Virgil was coming home. And to think it was so easy. Not so fast, brother.
Eric's voice of unreason rang through the room. The voice couldn't be mistaken for anyone else's. Before I could turn around, a dull pain clashed with my skull. I dropped Virgil on the ground and saw him bounce onto his side. I dropped to my knees and tried to stop the world from spinning. I shook my head while Patton was by my side helping me. I turned around to watch Logan facing Remus. I growled to myself. It's been years since I've seen Remus, and we didn't end on a good note. Remus was swinging his mace at Logan while he was sinking in and out. It almost made me laugh. Remus hates whack-a-mole. Pat and I took the hint. I bent down and grabbed Virgil when I was pushed to the side by a strong force. With the wind knocked out of me, I gasped heavily. I heard the sounds of Patton struggling. When it was over, I fumed with anger when I saw the Deceit, who now had Patton's hands pinned to his back.
Roman! Get Virgil!
Patton called out. Oh, sacrificing yourself. Deceit smoothly spoke in Patton's ear.
How very noble of you, morality. Stop!
Patton whispered in a shaky voice. I looked back and forth between Virgil's body and Patton, quickly choosing to help Patton. I stood up and charged Deceit, who was having a difficult time fighting me off and holding Patton back. He growled as I pushed Patton to the floor and then pushed me down into Patton. He loomed over us, breathing heavily, yet smiling wide and chaotic.
Now, I think we can all agree. 2 against 1 isn't fair,
Deceit cooed. He laughed before continuing.
Why don't we level the playing field? Anxiety,
he shouted, looking over in his direction. Pat and I turned as we watched Virgil's head look up and look around. With shaking arms, he picked himself up. He looked around, and once he saw us, my heart bloomed. He was all right. Thank God. He quickly rushed over to us. Or at least, I thought he saw us. I thought he was all right. Deceit. Are you hurt? He asked, throwing himself around Deceit. I don't know what I'd do if you were hurt. He paused and made eye contact with my confused eyes. He took steps behind Deceit, hiding behind him. Virgil looked back and forth between Patton and I wearily. I was in shock. Virgil siding with Deceit? Virgil! It's us! Remember? I cried out to him. Virgil shook his head and leaned into Deceit's ear. Who's Virgil? Part 24. Roman. Yes, Logan grumbled. I whipped my head around and saw Remus's foot on top of Logan's chest, while he made no motion to get up again. I looked back at Virgil, who was looking at Logan. I started to breathe rapidly as my thoughts swirled in my head like stew. I could tell by Virgil's face that he knew something was wrong, but couldn't find it in him to figure out why it was wrong. Virgil, come on! You know him! I gestured to Logan, who was still on the ground. Remus laughed as I tried to fight for Virgil's memories. That's Logan. He's smart and logical. He helps Thomas so much, just like you do. I'm sorry, but I don't. Virgil trailed off, shaking his head. Patton put a hand on my shoulder as I fought tears. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't going to believe it. Virgil was gone. He can't be. What did you do with him? I yelled towards Deceit, who chuckled and began to pet Virgil's hair. What? He just doesn't want to be a light side anymore, Deceit said. Virgil looked uncomfortable while Deceit petted him. His hands were shaking and his lips were quivering. My fist clenched. I let the tears start streaming down my face. I couldn't just sit and watch as Virgil was just clearly miserable. Virgil, wake up! This isn't you! I said sternly. Virgil's eyes were locked with mine, and his hands stopped shaking. My name is Roman, Virgil. Do you know me? He started to breathe harder. I... Virgil stuttered. Deceit was looking back between Virgil and I. Deceit knew I was breaking through to Virgil. I took a shaky breath before I continued. We met through Remus in the imagination when Thomas was 15 years old. When he was 17, you came into our home and saved Thomas's life. We had such a great time that day. Please, Virgil. You've got to believe me. That's enough from you. He hollered, whistling, making my hand and fist causing my hand to collapse over my mouth. Stop! Virgil yelled at the seat. I could tell Virgil regretted that. The seat's nostrils flared as Virgil shrunk in on himself. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Dee. I didn't mean that. The seat extended a hand as the same purple anxious energy struck Virgil in the stomach. Virgil yelled as he lowered to his knees, hugging himself with tears streaming down his face like a river. You will be sorry, Deceit said. With that, he delivered a kick into Virgil's chest. He fell onto his back and didn't move after that. Kiddo? Patton yelled frantically at Virgil, who did not respond. Deceit looked back to us and smiled. He turned his body so he was facing us. Remus walked over as well, holding a knocked-out Logan by the collar of his shirt. I think it's time we made our exits, Deceit said, as he turned her heels and stormed out. Remus dropped Logan, which made a thud on the ground. As Remus left, he grabbed Virgil's hood and dragged him back towards the imagination's door. Patton crawled out from underneath me and slowly made his way over to Logan. He was shaking him by the chest, looking for any sign of waking up. Patton's sobs were heartbreaking, but I understood his feelings. I quietly began to stand up, trying not to make too much noise. I ran at Remus and Deceit, pulling out my sword, ready to absolute anything to happen. As I was closer to Remus, I drove my sword through his right leg. He stopped and screamed in pain, letting go of Virgil, who weakly watched us. Remus turned around. He had a familiar look in his eyes, the look of an uncontrollable rage. He giggled wickedly and smiled. You made a bad choice, Remus said, surrounding his mace. Deceit stepped closer to Remus. I wonder if it was a good idea right now. Deceit caught Remus's attention and he lowered his mace. Heal, Remus. I'll take care of him, he stated. With that, Remus flipped me off and sunk down into his room to heal. In our rooms, we tend to heal faster. Deceit's hand lit up with a bright purple as he smiled. You sure you want to play this game? Absolutely, I responded. Have it your way, Deceit shrugged as he charged at me, a shot of little purple lightning strikes at me, which I was able to block with my sword. I heard Patton cheer me on, and I fueled with vigor in me to win. I swung my sword around, trying to hit Deceit, but he was faster than he seemed. He kicked my back, but I was able to stay on my feet. I looked back up and caught off guard by Deceit's running full force at me. I held my sword and looked away, awaiting sudden impact. However, it never came. Part 25. Patton. Logan's limp hand, and I watched Roman fight Deceit. It was intense, but I was barely paying attention. I looked down at Logan every couple of seconds to see if he was stirring at all. I placed a kiss on Logan's forehead and softly let a sob escape me. I heard Roman gasp and my eyes looked up swiftly at him. I watched while Deceit charged at Roman. He held his sword up as if he were a shield and waited. What he didn't see was Virgil slowly standing up and held his hands out in front of him. He seemed to be holding both Deceit and Roman in place. He looked just as shocked as Deceit. I didn't think Deceit thought Virgil had any more power left in him. Virgil was starting breathing fast, but he didn't lower his hands. I could tell he was having an internal fight in his head. Anxiety! Deceit jumped, causing him to jump a little. What are you doing? Let me go so I can kill him! Anxiety shook his head and Roman gave a nervous laugh. You remember me? Roman sighed. No, I'm sorry, Virgil said in response. But you seem to know me, so I don't know who to believe, he said nervously. Anxiety, you know me. I've raised you, Deceit said through gritted teeth, trying to sound sincere. We're like brothers. You and I and Remus. No, Virgil, he's wrong, Roman shouted back. He made you his prisoner. You weren't happy here, Virgil. He doesn't accept you, and he never will. Roman's voice was breaking, and Virgil just listened, which was obviously upsetting Deceit. Back at our house, you were happy. You were loved by Patton, by Logan, by me. Virgil's lips curled as if he started understanding, and Roman was saying more and more. Virgil's hands grabbed onto our heads as Deceit and Roman were released. Virgil was fighting himself again. No, stop! He kept murmuring to himself. Even though the two sides were released by Virgil, neither moved. They just watched. Finally, Deceit moved, but not towards Roman. He rushed to Virgil, grabbing his shoulders and shooting more of the anxious energy into Virgil, making him yell out in pain. Remember what you really are, Virgil. You are one of us, not one of them. Deceit growled. Virgil grabbed Deceit's shoulders. Virgil opened his eyes, locking his with Deceit, and at once, Deceit looked uncertain. You are wrong, Virgil hollered. With newfound strength, I watched Deceit get pushed to the floor. Virgil placed his foot on his chest. Virgil's eyes were still locked on Deceit's, and his body began to glow purple as Deceit did the same. Let's see how you like it, Virgil yelled, while purple mist came out from Deceit and flowed into Virgil. Deceit was squirming around, trying to fight Virgil's power. Roman and I watched powerlessly, but we were both beamed seeing our friend return to his normal self. The mist slowly faded away. Deceit sunk out. Roman cheered, and I clapped my hands in celebration as Virgil watched the ground where Deceit was. He was swaying in little amounts, which Roman keyed into as Virgil fell backward. Roman ran over and picked him up like he was his bride, his smile looking into his peaceful face. He's back, I simply said. Roman smiled and walked over to me and Logan. I heard some silent moans as Logan pushed himself up, sitting position. He rubbed his head and looked at me. Patton? He mumbled. I smiled and gave him a big hug. He returned it quickly, kissing the top of my head. I was so worried, Logie. I don't know what to do. I cried into his chest. We pulled apart. He lifted my chin, so I was looking at him. I would never leave you, Patton. I hope you know that. Logan cooed. I nodded happily as I helped him to his feet. Come on, guys, let's go home, Logan said as he headed towards the door. Logan and I wrapped our hands together and followed happily behind. Part 26. Virgil. I woke up with stiff pain through my entire body. I opened my eyes, seeing I was in my room, not the Dark Mind Palace, now with Deceit standing over me, just in my room. It was a nice change of pace. I sat up against my headboard. This felt all too familiar. I looked back and forth between the bathroom door and the closet. I heard a doorknob move, and I froze. My bedroom door opened, and Roman walked in. He looked surprised to see me awake, but not happy. You're awake, he said calmly. I smirked as he came around and sat next to me on the bed. Oh, he said suddenly. He pulled the pills out of his pocket and handed them to me, raised my eyebrow, and watched as he chuckled. Logan thought you might have a headache, so he told me to give you these. I see, I said, taking them from his hand and placing them into my mouth. I took a glass of water in that was already on my nightstand, swallowing them as Roman watched. What? I said as I watched him smile, causing me to do the same. I'm just so happy you're back, he said. He leaned in and we locked lips. Feeling the touch again was heavenly. I missed this so much. We pulled apart. I took a breath and spoke my mind. What exactly happened? He blinked, obviously confused. What do you mean? He asked. I shrugged, but continued. I mean, what did Deceit make me do? Well, you sided with him instead of us in the fight. I nodded and tried to remember for myself, but it was already so foggy. How did he get you like that? Roman asked. He bit me. Roman looked surprised, but I didn't. It's okay. He used to do that a lot whenever I rebelled. Basically, his venom makes you believe what he tells you. For me, he wanted me to be who I used to be. I sighed. He wanted me to be submissive and obedient towards him and Remus again. I blinked back small tears, and Roman put his hand on mine. But that doesn't matter now. Roman held his hand tighter, making me look up at him. Of course it matters. You matter, Virgil. I hope you understand that, Roman pleaded. I do. I nodded. I really do. Epilogue. I appeared back in the Dark Mind Palace a couple days later. I'll admit, I was winded after Virgil regained his memories. Damn Roman. Remus popped up a couple seconds later. By the looks of it, his leg was fine. He was putting weight on it, so it didn't seem to be bothered. Well, not by his leg anyway.
I'm gonna shove my mace right through that bastard's heart and rip out his organs one by one,
Remus screamed. I quickly put my hand on his shoulder, trying to soothe his mind, which I already knew was a lost cause. He looked at me with shock in his eyes. I knew by his expression we were thinking the same thing. He looked around the darkness, only seeing our table from before and the lamp, which was now on the floor. I sighed heavily, and followed by a smacking Remus on the face. You fucking idiot. You know he could be around.
I know. I'm sorry, Dee. You know how I get,
he said, twitching. He looked around again before we began walking back to the table. I think we're fine for now. The table still had the same papers on it, although now I could see some papers had fallen off the table. I started collecting them as Remus walked over and to the wall that housed Virgil while my venom sunk in. He picked them up, throwing them all over his shoulder, and huffed.
Back into the drawer of torture,
Remus giggled with delight. I ran my hands through my hair in a burst of rage. I smashed the papers in my hand onto the table, which gained a glance from Remus. How are we supposed to get Virgil back now? His friends will be on high alert.
Easy there, Dee. We'll find a way. He doesn't have to know about this.
Remus stuttered nervously. Oh, I already do, said a voice from the darkness. Remus and I both turned our heads. I put our shaking hands behind me while Remus rubbed his hands together in a nervous fit. Pounding footsteps shook the ground as a figure came closer and closer. I smiled a very fake smile, and Remus followed my move. He looked at both of us before smiling, giving a small chuckle. Oh, my gentlemen, we're all friends here. He put his hands up. I thickly swallowed and nodded along. I must say, the performance was a bit pathetic, even for you two. My very best workers for this job. But time goes on. He smiled again. Well, when you first don't succeed. And that is the end of the story. Not completely, though. There is a second book, which I'll continue reading next week. If you liked this, I would consider subscribing so you could get more stories every week on Wattpad Wednesday. There should be a playlist on the screen of all my Wattpad read-alouds if you like to read them. Some of my earlier ones are very bad, but they're still stories nonetheless, and I think the stories are really interesting. So, I hope you had a great time listening, and like always, do your best.